Alrighty, well, let's just start off with some basics. The Australian Constitution and kind of what that is. It's essentially Australia's rulebook. One thing it's not is all of the laws for Australia. So that can be quite a common misconception in that all of our laws must go into there. And the significant difference with that and understanding that means that if it's not in the Australian Constitution, doesn't make it illegal. So quite often you might hear, but show me in the Constitution where you can do that. Well, it doesn't need to be in the Constitution for where you can do that. This is just the rule book on how we set up Australia. And part of that, the big part of that, which we're going to get into soon, is the Parliament. And the Parliament makes all the laws that you then have to abide by, okay? There's 8 chapters in the Australian Constitution. There's 128 sections. There are some covering clauses and a schedule at the back as well. I'm going to put those in for a particular reason. But it's not very big. For those watching at home, this is a little pocket version of it. Everyone's, got to have one of these handy. This is the entire, in fact, it's more than the entire Constitution, because there's that much is an overview and an introduction by the, who's the forward by? Mark Dreyfus. Mark Dreyfus, the Attorney General. Yeah. So, yeah, that's the Constitution. In fact, I'm pretty sure if you've read the first Harry Potter, if you've read the first 3 chapters of the first Harry Potter, you've read more words than the Australian Constitution. So that's a good little tidbit. I mentioned here that it's got the covering clause because that's got an important bit in it. And in that, because throughout the whole Constitution, it refers to the Queen. The Queen this, the Queen that. And so a lot of people have gone, ha! The Queen is no longer around. This whole Constitution's invalid, right? I can do what I want. The Queen, this is now void. Well, by the same logic, it was void before because the Queen referenced in this is Queen Victoria in 1901, who was Queen of England, who then set this off. So, and in one of the covering clauses, I think clause 2, it basically says any reference to the Queen is in reference to the Queen and all her heirs and successors. So that includes Queen Elizabeth II, actually, and of course, King Charles III. So that's an important one to mention, just rebuff any sort of loopholes that we thought we were going to get out of, and now this whole thing's invalid. I put in the schedule there because that's going to come into play in, I think, a fortnight's time or thereabouts, where we're going to have a new Governor General. And one of the things in the schedule at the back of the Constitution is the oath and affirmation. So we're going to hear that on the 1st of July when our new Governor General, Sam Mostyn, will come and replace Sir David Hurley. So that's part of the Constitution too, the words that need to be said for a new Governor General to be sworn in. Now, there's 2 extra bits that I wanted to highlight with the Constitution. And the first is this sets up Australia as a constitutional monarchy. By the way, I should go back a little bit. The Constitution came into effect when Australia federated, when we were 6 colonies of Britain, acting like 6 different countries. And that meant we have different railways, they had different taxes, different defence forces. So you can imagine if WA was invaded, the New South Wales Army Corps weren't going to go over and help. We weren't one country. So they were like, this might not be the best thing for our future. Maybe we should all get together. And they all had to vote. So each colony had a referendum and they voted to federate. And before that process, they drafted the Constitution, took that around. Pretty cool things as well in there is that the New Zealand is still able to join as a state of Australia, according to the Constitution. They didn't take up on that yet. We'll see. Might cause some rifts with the Trans-Tasman rivalries, perhaps, if they ever joined. But that's in there. And interestingly, when Britain passed this, because this is an act of the British Parliament, WA had not got around to agreeing to federate. So there's a bit in there that says, and any of the other, if they get to it before 1st of January 1901, then they're also admitted. So that's quite cool. Yeah, so 1901, when we federated, 1st of January, this came into effect. As I mentioned, the second clause there talking about the Queen and all her heirs and successors, that linked with being referenced throughout the whole Constitution sets us up as a constitutional monarchy. So that we have a monarchy as the head of state is basically, it says whoever is the head of state of Britain becomes the head of state of Australia through this, but it's bound by the Constitution. They're restricted by what's in here. The other part it sets up is it sets us up as a representative democracy. So this is what bulk of what tonight is going to be about. So basically in here it says that the people of Australia are going to make the laws for Australia, and they're going to do that through their representatives. So we will elect, democratically vote in. They must be elected members of the House of Representatives and elected members of the Senate, and those people are able to make the laws for Australia. So that sets us up as a representative democracy. So you might hear those terms mentioned a bit. Okay, the Australian Constitution. This is, I think, section 1, chapter 1, sets up the Parliament. And it basically says we're going to have a king who can be represented by the Governor-General. We're going to have a Senate, and we're going to have a House of Representatives. By the way, it's in that order as well. So that is what the Parliament of Australia is. So when we talk about the Parliament of Australia, there are these 3 components. That's chapter 1, but remember, out of 128 sections, that's 60 of them. So really, that's what this document mostly does, is set up the Parliament. It does go ahead and also set up executive government. It sets up the judicial system with the High Court of Australia, those sorts of elements as well, and talks about the separation of powers, bits and pieces. There are some things that are not in here as well. Prime Minister, that's not in the Constitution. A Bill of Rights is not in the Constitution. So there is some myth dispelling as well. And that's another point of, well, just because it's not in here doesn't mean it's illegal. I think we're wrapping up with the Constitution part, talking about referendums. And it's probably fairly fresh in our mind because we had one last year. Interestingly, we did a little bit of digging and had a look at the average age of Australians, which I think is sitting around 38, 39. And that meant that for the referendum in October 2023, that most Australians had never voted in a referendum before, because in 1999, that cohort, that average was under 18. So they were around, but they weren't able to vote. So most Australians voted for the first time in last year's referendum. A referendum is section 128. It's the last section in the Australian Constitution. It details how to change the Constitution. And that's quite a handy thing, because the people that the drafters of the Constitution knew, well, Australia might change over time. So we want a mechanism to be able to do that and to change the Constitution. But because this is the rule book on how we set up Australia, it needs a special threshold. And that threshold is called a double majority. A bill passes through the Parliament for a referendum. It has to pass the House and the Senate. But then it goes, instead of going to the Governor-General to be signed and turned into an Act of Parliament, a new law, the Governor-General goes, hang on, this is to change the Constitution. I'm not signing this yet. I'm going to send it now to the Australian Electoral Commission to organise a referendum and ask the people of Australia to vote. And it needs to pass through this double majority system. And this double majority reflects the 2 houses of Parliament. It reflects the House of Representatives being a majority of Australians. So the first threshold is, did over 50% of Australians vote in favour for the change? But then it's got this second threshold, which is, did a majority of states around Australia also vote in favour? And that reflects the Senate, which is state representation, because in the Senate, all states have the same number of senators. So this reflects, you know, the concerns with the drafting of the Constitution, that the populous states can't just overrule the whole country. You need support across Australia as well as within a majority of Australians. For those of us playing in the ACT or the Northern Territory, perhaps online, you'll notice it says a majority of states, not territories. So that's why people were like, hang on a second, we're not counted in that second double majority threshold. We are counted in the first, but we're not counted there in the second because it says the majority of states. We have 6 states. A majority is not 3. You require 4 or more states to agree to have a majority yes. If you get that threshold, then it goes back to the Governor General and gets signed. Speaking of the Governor General, this is the figurehead, if you like, representing the monarch. And they are the Governor General for as long as they are there on the Queen's presence and all her heirs and successors, of course. On her Queen's pleasure, sorry. So that means for as long as the monarch is happy with the Governor General, then they can stay the Governor General. Usually it's 5 years. It doesn't strictly have to be, but it's a 5-year term. It's, convention then kicks in and it's a 5-year term. That 5-year term is coming up very, very soon for Sir David Hurley, as I mentioned before, and on the 1st of July, Sue Mostyn is going to become our next Governor General, 28th Governor General, I think it is. So that's kind of Governor General and setting up the Constitution. Did anyone have any questions about the Australian Constitution? And that can include online. I think I've got someone in the chat. Yep, well, we can see him now. That's great.
The Governor General just kind of takes it on faith. This has been voted on in the Parliament, etc. They're like, the Gough Whitlam thing aside, they will just sign things.
Yeah, and essentially yes, because they are there not representing the Australian people. They're there representing the monarch. So they don't get to add a layer of, I really don't like this idea, I'm not going to sign it. It's a protocol thing. But they do have a check and balance component. So their job is to check that the bill that was passed has gone through the proper process through the Parliament, and they'll do that check. Yeah. So I'll mention that a bit more with going through the House. But yes, because they don't represent the Australian people, they represent the monarch, they don't get to have a say. They don't get an opinion on it. They are nominated to the monarch by the Prime Minister, the sitting Prime Minister of the day. So Anthony Albanese has nominated Sue Mostyn. Sam Mostyn, sorry. Assuming that she's obviously said yes. And then obviously the monarch's just happy to sign that off.
So in the States over the last few years, there's been a lot of questions about the difference between convention and like the actual requirements. I think you said that there's a lot of convention around this role, but really it's a process-based role, like check rules.
Yep.
Rather than the substance.
Yeah. And so rather than making decisions individually. And so what controls are there around that? It can't just be convention.
Well, there'd be contradictions.
Or would, if they stepped outside of their role, then obviously...
If they stepped outside their role and said, no, I'm not signing this one, I don't really agree with it, then that might contradict other parts of this that say we're a representative democracy. We've not voted for the Governor General. So if they started exercising powers that are outside of, where they in their lane,
powers they should, consequences of the decade.
Proper process, then you could argue that, well, hang on a second, we might have to go to the High Court because that's going to start contradicting other parts, which say that Australians make the laws, basically.
It is important, though, Kerr didn't actually break the Constitution. He broke every convention that the Parliament operated under. But he didn't actually do anything
unconstitutional.
So it's, I mean, convention is really strong until it's no longer.
Until someone breaks it and starts a new convention. But and there is a lot, even within parliamentary process, that is understood as convention, but might not be breaking, standing orders and things like that. So,
so there's a bit of wiggle room in there.
There's a lot of wiggle room. There's nothing in here that says where the Governor General has to be sworn in. It's been convention that it's happened in the Senate, and it will happen in the Senate. But at the last one, there was commentary saying, well, there's no reason it has to be there. Why does it have to be there? It's a sitting day. It would have been a sitting day otherwise. The Senate, the House and Senate exists. It's a convention. Yeah.
So the example you brought up in relation to Kerr is in relation to what event specifically?
The Gough Whitlam dismissal in 75.
Right. So essentially we've got a situation where the Governor General can trigger the removal of an Australian Prime Minister outside of that convention. Because they're the Governor General.
The governor, as Prime Minister's not in here, and the government. Oh well, we'll get to I'll mention the government bit later because it'll fit in a bit later with the next bit. But yeah, I'll come back to that.
Wiggle room.
Some wiggle room, yeah, okay. yeah. There are in the Constitution there are kind of boundaries as to the limit, and there are things called I can't remember, but there's a lot in the Constitution as well which sets up kind of the start, if you like, and then it says until the Parliament provides.
Okay.
So they might say, like in here it says that the Governor General I think is getting paid £12,000, right? Until the Parliament otherwise provides. So clearly that's gone up a bit, and not in pounds anymore. so there's things like that. So there are bounds and stuff, but then it's, there's those until the Parliament provides. So there's a lot of bits and pieces, and some people will pull that up and go, oh, hang on, but in the Constitution it says this. Yeah, but you missed this line here that says until the Parliament provides, and since 1901 they've provided a different version and they keep updating that, right? So there are those bits as well.
My only reflection is what a travesty that. That's why I sort of reacted like I did when you said you were into civics. Like, what a travesty that the vast majority of the population have never seen that document.
Yeah.
Well,
No
to
idea.
reassure you, the kids do, because my son in primary school, they had for year 6 instead of a school council, they had a school parliament. And Rowan was the constitutional representative, and so he drove the teacher nuts because he would argue everything from the Constitution. Got heaps of things in, so they do learn it at school in quite a lot of detail. Because he had that little book, I didn't realize it was the entire Constitution.
Yeah, no, that's
he
it.
read that cover to cover and used it against.
Yeah, it should be up here. This is great.
I guess the other thing that you're saying though is there's the Constitution, and then there are these, as the Parliament provides, all these other acts that will, so in turn, you can't just read the Constitution and interpret everything. You have to know all the others. Not at all. Which is why they interview Anne Toomey or something like that.
Yeah, who know it inside out, who can predict what the High Court might say, and that changes. Like Section 44, we all know about Section 44, where well, and it's a weird one, right? Like Section 44 basically says, it doesn't say you can only be an Australian citizen. It basically says you need to have not be under the influence of a foreign power. And that's now up for interpretation, and that's where the High Court comes in, which is another thing.
It's not necessarily protective, as we've just gone.
No, not necessarily. So, but think about, like, in 1901, the year that Australia existed, in 1900, there were no Australian citizens because the country of Australia didn't exist. So, so obviously back then, a foreign power was fine if it was Britain, right? Because the whole Parliament were British, basically. So, it evolves, and that's where the High Court comes in. And then the High Court, was it 2016 or thereabouts, said, hang on a second, you can't have dual national. You need to be only an Australian citizen. That's how we're defining it. And then bang, 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 a whole bunch of people had to leave, and all sorts of fun ensued. Yeah.
Sorry. When nerds unite.
I know. We're gonna dig down.
I love it.
It's so good. Nicole mentions as well that about in the Constitution, it does set out Section 52, I think it is, sets out the responsibilities of a Commonwealth government. So basically, we think that at the time, with all them having different militaries and stuff, it says, well, we're going to take that responsibility from the what then becomes the states, and we're going to take that to a federal level. Anything not mentioned in here can remain with the states. And then there is a bit in here that also says if there is a conflict, if there's, because you can have concurrent stuff, but if there's a conflict between the two, then the federal level takes over. It's complex, right? Because there are lots of areas that the Commonwealth doesn't want to run, but then they want to have influence. So they might say, well, we'll give the states X billion dollars or X millions to run it, to do this particular program. So the responsibility of running it is not the Commonwealth's, but they might pay for it and then say you have to run it through this program. Look, and the great example of where this really came into play was with COVID.
Oh, yes.
You had federal government saying we should open up, or we should do this, or we should do that, and the states are like coming together going, nah, this is our responsibility, we're going to control, this is our health system, all that sort of stuff. So it was a really interesting power play between the states and the federal, because the feds were coming in going, we should be doing this, and then we sort of could see kind of some of the effects of this as to the states going, well, actually, federal elections, just a couple of points here I wanted to mention with how we get our representatives elected here at a federal level.